The BIA boarding schools were the first attempt to try and shape what the future of Indian people would look like. Tribes signed treaties that guaranteed they'd be entitled to food, clothes, blankets, while being confined to the reservation, often without the weapons that were necessary to hunt and survive. And now the federal government is telling them, if you're unwilling to surrender your children to go to these schools, we'll withhold food and clothes and blankets. So the parents are left with the decision, do I give up my little ones to go to these schools, or do I let my whole family starve? And the effort was to kill the Indian and save the child, which was progressive thinking for that time period. In the late 50s, early 60s, CWLA, the Child Welfare League of America, was the cutting edge thinking on what progressive child rearing practices ought to be. They got together with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, created the Indian Adoption Project. The justification for the Indian Adoption Project was the use of the rubric of neglect to justify the fact that these children were being deprived of a good life because they were still tied to notions of tradition and culture.
On the Potawatomi Reservation in Hannahville, Michigan, the families made their living by harvesting pulpwood, and they would go out as a couple and gather and harvest this pulpwood, leaving the older children to watch the younger children. Social workers found out that they were doing this, and they came in and they got almost 200 children. And those parents were charged with child neglect, and they never saw those children again.
One of the reservations still didn't have electricity. So children were removed because it was considered a not safe environment. And yet, not too many decades, before that, you could go many places in rural America, and people were still, using kerosene lanterns for light. So I don't consider that a good excuse. I consider that that was just somebody using middle class standards and values to judge how other people live.
In the mid-1970s, Congress did an assessment of life in Indian country, and the rates varied from state to state, but they were pretty consistent, that Indian kids were removed much more often than was necessary. That became the driving force for the adoption of the Indian Child Welfare Act.